Thanks to ExpressVPN for keeping Legal Eagle safe and in the air. In the wake of systemic police abuse that was brought to a head by what we saw with George Floyd, people are out in the streets and they are demanding police reform. And it's an idea whose time has come. But apart from just entirely disbanding the police, what can we possibly do? Well, as an officer of the court, I have some ideas. Hey Legal Eagles, it's time to think like a lawyer because it appears that the time has come for true police reform.
We cannot settle for anything less than transformative structural change.
A broad coalition of people are working to change the way that police departments operate. Legislators are writing bills. State and local governments, as well as the federal government, seem to have heard those cries and appear to be amenable for something that was completely off the table just a few short months ago. But that raises the question, if we're going to change the way the police operate, what exactly are we going to do? The good and bad news is that a lot of the reforms that people are calling for are very easy to implement. It only takes the political will to do so. And changing the way the police operate can be a very, very difficult task in a political economy. And traditionally speaking, politicians love the police. It's hard to lose an election battle if you are on the side of the police departments.
We have to respect our police. We have to take care of our police. They're protecting us.
And being tough on crime, which is one of the reasons why it's been so difficult to usher in police reform. But perhaps the time is now. There seems to be a broad coalition growing and calling for real concrete steps. And the good news is there's tons of low-hanging fruit for police reform that will lead to more just outcomes for almost everyone and more just policing. But before we dive into some of these reforms, some of which I think are complete no-brainers, let's talk for a second about the problems with maximalism and trade-offs. Because in this debate, people want different things. Some people want safety, low crime. Others want human dignity and justice. Taxpayers want low cost and low taxes. Some people want higher enforcement of crimes and punishment rates. Police officers often want job safety and other individuals want privacy. And a lot of these different things are at odds with each other. And we have to recognize that when you turn one of these dials, the other dials move. So it's possible that some of these reforms might cost more tax money. Some of these reforms might result in fewer crimes being punished when the crime actually occurs. Some of these reforms might cause police officers to be less safe in their jobs. And these are all trade-offs. I'm not here to choose which one is more important than the other, but all of these dials move in conjunction with each other, and there are going to be trade-offs with some of these particular reforms. I happen to personally believe that we should move the dial in terms of justice and fairness with respect to individual citizens, and if that means some higher costs, well, that might be a trade-off that's worthwhile. But it would be very silly to claim that all of these reforms are going to be a free lunch. There's no such thing as a free lunch. But let's talk about some of the reforms that are in the air. I'm not here to advocate for any particular one of these, but I think a lot of these potential reforms have the potential to really be a game changer when it comes to justice and fairness throughout America when it comes to the police. So in no particular order, here are some ideas that really could make a huge difference when it comes to fairness in the police. First, body cameras. A lot of jurisdictions don't have body cameras. Luckily, there are a lot of federal programs that help provide funding to local municipal police departments so that they can provide body cameras when it wouldn't otherwise be in the budget. But the technology exists for body cameras on police officers to record basically continuously while that police officer is patrolling. And it seems crazy that the police officer would have the control to be able to turn off and on the body camera at whim. And we've seen instances where police officers have actually planted drugs on suspects and then turned their body camera on minutes later. And the only reason we know that is that the police officer didn't know that the body camera had a pre-record functionality. But let's do away with all of that and just have body cameras on all the time. And there could be penalties for police officers that intentionally block or turn off their body cameras during important events. And this is one reform that I think most police officers should be in favor of, because while the cultural zeitgeist is full of accounts, horrific accounts of police misconduct, especially in the wake of peaceful protests, it'd be silly to think that all of the complaints against the police are meritorious. In fact, probably the majority of the complaints that are made against police are not meritorious and are probably made by criminals who are not happy with the fact that they were arrested. So having footage of interactions with potential suspects where the police can clearly show that they engaged in no misconduct inures to the benefits of the police as well. And next is the issue of public access to information regarding police misconduct. Now, we've already acknowledged that some police misconduct or allegations of police misconduct is completely fabricated, but also some of that information is absolutely not fabricated, and we have to admit that the police engage in misconduct. And it's important that because police are public servants, that not just convictions regarding police misconduct, but also even allegations of police misconduct be made available to both the cities and the people who those cities serve. And the statistics tend to bear this out as well, that only a small number of police officers are responsible for the vast majority of allegations and convictions of police misconduct. So it's very important to have access to that data, that information, to know who those potential bad apples are.
And you always have a bad apple no matter where you go. You have bad apples. And there are not too many of them, and I can tell you there are not too many of them in the police department.
And by the way, the metaphor of the bad apples, it's being thrown around a lot, especially by police officers and police departments claiming that it's only a couple of bad apples. Well, remember, that analogy is that a handful of bad apples will spoil the entire barrel of apples. So when you have a potential systemic issue, the fact that you're pointing to a couple of bad apples doesn't actually support your argument that it's individuals and not the system itself. Because those couple of bad actors, those bad apples, can have a corrupting influence on the rest of the entire department. So be careful what metaphors you use in what particular context. It's important to know what those words mean. But even if we were to take the idea that these are isolated individuals that don't have a larger systemic issue, one of the more meta things that police departments, I think, should do is inculcate this culture of weeding out the bad apples from the rest of the department. Certainly, there are going to be individuals who are worse than other individuals, and they might have a corrupting influence. And the stats bear out that they might be responsible for more of the misconduct than other people. So if you are a good police officer who is not engaging in misconduct, you should want to get those other people out. But what we've seen is that this blue wall or this blue line prevents getting out the bad actors. So I would like to see, and I don't know how one would accomplish this per se, but police departments should have a culture of weeding out the bad apples, because they shouldn't be there. One way you might do that is by having a whistleblower system that tends to exist on the federal level, though that's being eroded day by day. Still, the idea of whistleblowers or providing rewards to individuals who are willing to buck the trend of the rest of the department to be able to report and get rid of bad actors where they exist. I think that that is a very meritorious system, a good philosophy, and I don't know how one would do that, but it's something that police departments should aspire to. Though on the other side, if that is the carrot in terms of getting people to report bad behavior, the stick portion of that would be a duty to report, such that if you witness bad conduct taking place, and this does exist in some police departments, then the individual officers have a duty to report that bad conduct up the chain or to investigative affairs. But you could take a two-pronged approach. You can reward whistleblowers who come forward, and you can also create a duty to report such that individual officers are liable when they fail to report egregious conduct. But when you're talking about the culture of the police department, it's impossible to overlook the elephant in the room, and that's police unions. This is probably one potential avenue that's going to be the most divisive, even amongst people that want to reform police departments. But there is no argument that police unions have a huge amount of power. And partly it's by design. Police unions are designed so that they create collective bargaining power so that they can help police officers get more favorable working conditions and more favorable terms under which they work. The downside to that is that the police union has, as a client, its police officers.
I will defend those that stand here. I will defend my family. I will defend our citizens, both here and who are now in phase one going back to work.
And often what's in the best interest of the community is not in the best interest of the police officers themselves or the police union writ large. And part of the issue here is that some of the things that the police unions often negotiate over are not just things like salary or hours or retirement benefits, but things like what happens when individual police officers are accused of misconduct. Often you'll see in the collective bargaining agreements that the police officers, if they are accused of egregious misconduct, misconduct have a certain cooling off period where it might be 48 or 72 hours before other police officers are even allowed to interview the police officers accused of misconduct of what actually happened. And what we have seen is that during that amount of time, think about what they're going to say to the people who are investigating. They think about getting their stories straight. They think about what particular chain of events would be most beneficial to themselves. And it will not surprise you that if you are a normal citizen who is accused of criminal misconduct, you don't get the same kind of protections that the police do because of the contracts that are written into the collective bargaining agreements between the police union and the police departments. And I've heard stories of police unions giving individual officers more or less a script to recite when they are accused of unlawful use of force. And so they can get their story to line up with the thing that is the best legal defense.
And the only option I left was my firearm. This has to work, otherwise I'm going to be dead. He's going to get this gun away from me. Something's going to happen, and I'm going to be dead.
And these are just a handful of examples how, in many ways, police officers get special treatment when they are accused of misconduct on their own. And that's not to say that police unions don't provide real benefits, but if people are really serious about creating a more just and fair system for everyone, not just police officers, certainly people are going to have to take a serious look at the power that police unions have in this country. And because of the power that police unions have in this country, it's often been incredibly difficult to get police reforms because as a political entity, they tend to fight any kind of change at all.
Beginning today, as chief, I am immediately withdrawing from the contract negotiations with the Minneapolis Police Federation. I plan to bring in subject matter experience and advisors to conduct a thorough review of how the contract can be restructured to provide greater community transparency and more flexibility for a true reform.
So if we were going to use a general principle here, we might say that perhaps there can be a rule that says police officers can't get any special treatment above and beyond what any other normal citizen would get when accused of criminal misconduct. And when it comes to police oversight, perhaps we should rethink the idea that the police are able to police themselves, where instead of the police overseeing themselves, there is a board of civilians, or at least non-police officers, who are able to look at the potential misconduct and make a judgment over it. And perhaps even better than just a civilian oversight board is a civilian oversight board with the ability to make high-stakes decisions, that if they do find misconduct, they are able to levy penalties against the police officers or potentially even fire them. Now, obviously, this is something that police unions want to fight against because they don't want some other third party having sway over individual police officers, but it's something that other police departments have done and can make sure that when there is misconduct, that the bad actors are punished for it. And on that score, perhaps an obvious one is real consequences for bad conduct. When there is a conviction for police misconduct, there need to be real stakes so that individuals are punished for engaging in that kind of misconduct. And one way that is sort of in the cultural zeitgeist these days is ending or limiting what's called qualified immunity. Now, this is a topic for another day. I'm going to do another set of videos regarding what's called a Section 1983 claim under federal law, which is limited by this immunity that police officers often receive called qualified immunity, which is an impediment to some federal lawsuits being served against individual police officers and individual police departments. But suffice to say, there are bills before Congress that would abrogate this immunity, this qualified immunity for the police officers and police departments, which might provide an incentive to not engage in misconduct or at least try and curtail it, because if there are all these lawsuits, then the police departments don't want to get defunded. So I will cover that in depth in future videos because it's a very, very complicated subject. And in terms of the real nuts and bolts, there is a movement on social media called 8 Can't Wait for 8 particular tactics that a particular group thinks would make a big difference in terms of making police departments less violent. These 8 particular tactics include banning chokeholds outright, which many police departments have done, although Minneapolis is a notable exception to that, requiring de-escalation before moving forward with violent force, requiring a warning before shooting, exhausting all other means intervenes before shooting, creating a duty to intervene so that when police officers see criminal misconduct or can help an individual, they intervene in that situation, banning shooting at moving vehicles, requiring a use of force continuum before escalating, and requiring comprehensive reporting of use of force. I'd recommend taking a deeper dive into the stats that this movement has offered about the efficacy, but there's definitely some potential in some of these reforms to create a less violent police department. Now, in a prior video, I mentioned that saying police officers are soldiers in a war for America makes them sort of feel like soldiers, and when that happens, the police acts more like soldiers than actual police. But one of the other reasons why police officers engage in additional military or violent tactics is that they are clad in all kinds of surplus military equipment. Now, one of the reasons that we've seen that over the last few years is that there is a federal law that allows the federal government to give police departments surplus military equipment at cost or at no cost, so long as they use that equipment within 1 year. So I probably don't need to tell you that this creates all kinds of backwards incentives. Number one, police departments are going to want to do what they can to get free military equipment. And number two, the law as currently written incentivizes them to actually use it too on a use it or lose it basis. And I'll be the first to admit that driving around in a repurposed Humvee or MRAP looks like a whole lot of fun. But the last thing that we want to do is to make police feel like they're soldiers on the front lines of America. That's not how you get just outcomes for citizens. It's no wonder that police wearing riot gear being transported around in troop carriers feel like soldiers, and that leads to escalation. And we've seen that with peaceful protesters, and that seems like the very last thing that we want. And another potential way to limit the number of violent encounters that happen with police in sort of outside the box thinking is perhaps we need to send non-police sometimes. In America, pretty much everyone knows how to dial the police, 911. But often the police might not be the right people, the right public servants to send to any given situation. Perhaps we need to rethink when we deploy the police. So for example, say that someone is having an issue with someone who has a mental health issue. Instead of sending the police, which is basically the default in America, perhaps we can send a non-police health worker or a social worker, that if things escalate, if things are likely to get potentially violent, or if there is a violent crime potentially perpetrated, then at that point the police can be called. But perhaps the first person who is called is not a police officer. But that does remind me of something that I've seen in particular in Washington, D.C., which is that when police officers are called, I think everyone would agree those officers need to be clearly identified. Recently, we've seen all kinds of unidentified military and police officers roaming the streets of Washington, D.C. with no clear identification. And I think a very, very good thing that pretty much everyone has a video camera in their pocket and they're able to document police misconduct when it happens. And we've certainly seen hundreds, if not thousands of examples of that during the protests. Obviously, some force was probably justified during riots and looting, but by and large, the protests have been peaceful. So when you have police using force, using rubber bullets, using tear gas, we need to know who these individuals are, let alone times when they're using force, deadly or not, to subdue potential suspects. And in terms of protests, we might consider banning the use of rubber bullets and tear gas in general. It's not clear that the police have the rules available to use that kind of equipment responsibly. Now, obviously, there are times when there are going to be protests and riots that are much more violent than what we've seen as of late. But perhaps as a general rule, or with a very specific escalation of force, we might put rules in place that prevent them from using those tools in these circumstances. And of course, it's important to acknowledge that police have a dangerous job, but sometimes that danger is overblown. If I can digress for a moment, currently the stats show that the police officer is the 14th most dangerous job in the United States, somewhere between taxi drivers and construction workers. So sure, being a police officer might be considered a dangerous job, but there are many, many other jobs that are actually much more dangerous than being a police officer, and obviously these individuals receive none of the kinds of protections when people accuse them of misconduct. And one of the more meta things that definitely strikes close to home is that we have a lot of laws. in this country. And theoretically, every single law that's on the books could result in someone with a gun trying to enforce it. And we've seen relatively minor infractions leading to a suspect being killed, whether it's kiting checks or passing a bad bill or trying to sell cigarettes without the correct certification. Those are all examples of people who were accused of minor crimes that, because the police were called and admittedly they had breached those laws, they were detained using violent force and individuals died as a result of those. So perhaps we need to rethink some of the laws that are on the books, or at the very least, authorization of using physical or violent force to detain people who are accused of very minor crimes. Now, some people might not like that because it might lead to laws being not enforced. But I think as a society, we need to ask ourselves what kind of laws justify the potential for someone dying as a result of breaching that law. And since we're on the topic of police enforcing minor, sometimes misdemeanor laws, perhaps we might consider disassociating the revenue that comes from those penalties from police departments. Because often the police departments directly benefit from that revenue. It's hard to not think of Ferguson, where there was an entire police culture of trying to get as much money from penalties as possible. Things like speeding tickets or penalties from misdemeanors. All of that revenue, when it was generated, often from very low income communities, went directly to the police department. So it created this terrible incentive of being very particular about enforcing everything and getting as much money as possible from the community. So if the police department didn't benefit from that revenue, it might create an incentive not necessarily to enforce some of these very low-level infractions. And speaking of the community, we might want more community involvement from police. Some of the police departments that have done a generally very good job have been proactive about trying to make sure that not only the high-level police officers, but even mid and low-level police officers are involved in the community. People often talk about requiring police to live in the areas that they actively police, but that's probably more of a proxy for just knowing the community itself, knowing who is there, getting to know those people, and instead of all police interactions being only when things have gone wrong, showing that the police presence is there to help the community, to listen to the community ahead of time, and really having that institutional knowledge instead of waiting for things to go bad and only having police interactions being at the point of a gun. Though one of the issues here is that often police departments are just a patchwork quilt throughout the entire United States with no overarching guidelines and no data sharing. And often the police departments don't have the budget to do those sort of things. So it might be important for the federal government to take an oversight role here. Perhaps there can be a central federal oversight or data clearinghouse center where the federal government provides the funds and the manpower to gather all of the relevant statistics and to provide some oversight to all of the different states and individual police departments throughout. And on a more coercive tact, perhaps the federal government through the Department of Justice needs to get more involved in terms of investigating individual police departments in states that have a systemic issue. Effectively, over the last few years, the department has stopped investigating individual police departments. I can't remember the time the Department of Justice issued a consent decree against individual police departments to help enforce rights. And that's a worrying trend because that's one of the oversight roles of the Department of Justice. And while the federal government should probably have some oversight role over state and local police departments, we don't want the police having too much oversight over you. So if you're using the internet out in the wild and you don't want the police looking at your internet traffic, you should definitely try ExpressVPN. For those of you who don't already know, a VPN basically creates a secure tunnel from whatever device you're using and the internet, keeping your digital privacy intact. And it's a big issue because every time you connect to an unencrypted Wi-Fi network at airports, hotels, coffee shops, and even at home, you're at risk. ExpressVPN encrypts your internet connections using the highest standards of encryption currently available. A big problem in the US is that ISPs track and sell your browsing habits to advertisers. In my experience, ExpressVPN is also the fastest VPN by far. And with ExpressVPN, you can also reroute your connection to a server in a country of your choice, giving you unrestricted access to parts of the internet and making geo-restrictions a thing of the past. Take watching Netflix, for example. Say I want to watch one of my favorite British sci-fi shows about a time-traveling alien doctor. What can I say? I'm a fan. But the selection with me being in the United States isn't the same as if I was in the UK. So once I switch my VPN, I can watch pretty much whatever I want, whenever I want. Or maybe I want to see what's trending in YouTube in Belgium or Japan. I can route my traffic there. I'm huge in Japan, I assume. ExpressVPN also has 24/7 customer support, which means your questions will be answered within seconds, not hours. And you don't have to take my word for it. ExpressVPN is rated #1 by TechRadar, CNET, The Verge, and Comparitech, and many others. So if you want to join, just head over to expressvpn.com/legaleagle right now and find out how you can get 3 months free. Again, that's expressvpn.com/legaleagle, or just click the link down in the description. Plus, clicking on that link really helps out this channel. So, do you agree with my analysis? Are there other ways that we should reform the police, or should we leave the police just the way that they are? Leave your objections in the comments, and check out this playlist over here with all of my other analysis about legal issues raised in the news today. And just click on this playlist, and I'll see you in court.